Deadwood is widely considered to be one of the greatest Western TV shows ever made, and one of HBO's most acclaimed series. So why did they make the infamous decision to cancel it after just 3 seasons? Well, the answer is a little more complicated than you might expect. But first, it's important to make clear that it wasn't simply due to a lack of popularity. Because when Deadwood premiered on March 21st, 2004, it immediately captured the imagination of millions, with the plot centering around the brutal, chaotic expansion of the real-life frontier settlement of Deadwood, South Dakota, inhabited by fictional versions of real-life figures such as Al Swearingen, Seth Bullock, Calamity Jane, and even Wild Bill Hickok. So the show was a must-watch for Western fans, but it also managed to appeal to a much wider mainstream audience as well, thanks to its gripping performances, unforgettable characters, and richly layered poetic writing. As such, Deadwood received widespread praise from critics and audiences alike, with the show averaging approximately 4.5 million viewers across its first season. And this was all thanks to its creator, David Milch, an experienced American screenwriter who at the time was best known for creating the long-running police drama NYPD Blue. But it was Deadwood that really showed what he was capable of, elevating him from a respected TV writer to one of the most highly regarded creative voices in prestige television. However, Deadwood also earned Milch the reputation of being a perfectionist, who had no qualms about completely reshooting scenes and rewriting dialogue on the fly. For example, Ian McShane recalls rewrites arriving so late that the pages were still warm from the copier, while Timothy Olyphant claims that the decision to kill off the character of William Bullock was abruptly made by Milch one day over lunch in his trailer.
There was some brouhaha going on. Somebody connected to that actor was being a pain in the ass. It didn't sit well with Milch. Within just an hour or two, there was a knock on my trailer door and Milch is there. I said, what's going on? He said, we're going to kill the kid.
So Deadwood was a show that was in constant creative flux, which could well be part of the reason why the drama always felt so authentic and engrossing. But this approach came at a cost, as Deadwood was already a very complex production, with a large ensemble cast and period setting, so any changes, no matter how small, all served to inflate the overall budget of the show, meaning that a single episode could often cost as much as $4.5 million. But it would seem that HBO was happy to foot the bill, given that Deadwood was a critical darling and posted respectable ratings. However, between season 1 and 2, the show lost nearly half of its viewership, beginning a downward trend that continued into season 3. Now that isn't to say that the ratings were bad or that the show was in major decline, but for a series as expensive as Deadwood, it was important that HBO saw a return on investment, and ultimately as a premium channel, it was always going to prioritize shows that were luring in the most subscribers. And during the mid-2000s, that tended to be boundary-pushing contemporary shows like The Sopranos and The Wire, meaning that Deadwood looked more and more like an oddity on its lineup that didn't necessarily gel with its other programming, despite being just as ambitious and highly regarded. Yet despite all of this, HBO made no public indication that they intended to cancel Deadwood, and season 3 ended with numerous unresolved storylines that would lead anyone watching to naturally assume that another season was on the way. But rumour has it that before a 4th season could go into production, HBO and Paramount, who co-produced the show, ultimately ended up coming to an impasse over how to split the profits from Deadwood, leaving the future of the series up in the air. Although HBO did offer David Milch an opportunity to save the show, with the proposal of a 6-episode final season to wrap up the story. But Milch refused, saying, "It seemed to me that some sort of partial order for the show would make it impossible to do anything but superimpose all sorts of interpretations that would deprive it of its own emotion." As a result, HBO opted not to exercise the option to renew the cast's contracts for a 4th season, with the then HBO chief executive and chairman Chris Arbrecht later saying, "Not having a 4th season of Deadwood is not the result anyone wanted." So this allowed the actors from the show to pursue other projects, with Timothy Olyphant securing the role of his lifetime as Raylan Givens in Justified, while Ian McShane bagged roles in big film franchises such as Pirates of the Caribbean, Game of Thrones, and John Wick. In fact, it would seem that most of the principal cast of Deadwood experienced a noticeable profile boost from their time on the show, with many going on to star in other popular TV series. Meanwhile, Deadwood now seemed as if it had no future, given that none of the cast were obliged to ever appear in the show again, even if it were renewed. However, in 2006, just days before the season 3 premiere, HBO announced that David Milch had agreed to conclude the show with a pair of 2-hour-long specials, as a means of bringing closure to the narrative. But with David Milch working on other projects and the cast pursuing different roles, the likelihood of this happening was very much in doubt, with a HBO executive admitting a year later that the chances of the telefilms ever being made was 50-50. And it would seem that with each passing year, the odds decreased a little more, until finally in 2009, Ian McShane officially announced that Deadwood is dead. Following this news, Deadwood quickly became one of the most famous examples of a beloved show that was unfairly axed before its time, leaving fans with no closure or conclusion to its story. However, in 2019, HBO, seemingly out of nowhere, finally gave in and released Deadwood the movie, written by David Milch, which managed to pull off the impressive task of reuniting most of the original cast while also bringing back director Dan Minahan, who directed 4 episodes of the show's original run. And the 2-hour movie did an excellent job of capping off the story, picking up with the residents of Deadwood 10 years after the events of season 3, both advancing their stories and concluding them at the same time, in what proved to be a satisfying, emotional final chapter that really did justice to the show in the way that fans had always wanted. In fact, the movie was so well received by critics and fans alike that it naturally led to speculation about whether Deadwood might be able to continue beyond the movie, especially considering that the original plan in 2006 was for there to be a pair of 2-hour specials. Ian McShane even teased in a 2019 interview that more Deadwood could be a possibility, saying, "It ends leaving you wondering, and if it makes $115 million, HBO will somehow find a way to do another one." But in reality, given how long it took just to make the 2009 movie and how perfectly it capped off the story, the chances of a sequel now seem very slim, and will likely be at the discretion of its creator David Milch, who in 2015 was sadly diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And he decided not to publicly reveal the diagnosis until the release of Deadwood the movie, which he wrote with significant help from collaborators, due to the disease's progressive impact on his recall and organisation. So I think most would agree that this added context only makes Deadwood the movie feel even more of an achievement in hindsight, as it really was a labour of love from everyone involved, including the cast, its creator, and all the fans that spent 13 years hounding HBO for a revival that nobody really thought would ever happen. But I'd be interested to hear below, how do you reflect on the Deadwood series, and what were your thoughts on the movie? Also, if you enjoyed this video, you might also want to check out this one right here.